If we imagine a world where Bitcoin is the global money, it could be that you have currencies that governments issue, but we know currencies are not the same thing as money. So the US dollar is a currency, but that doesn't mean it's money. Eric Trump especially is interested in Bitcoin mining, and he thinks Bitcoin's inevitably going to go to $1 million. And so he's very much pro-Bitcoin, especially due to the fact that his family has been debanked and, essentially financially persecuted. So now gold looks like a more volatile asset than it was, let's say, 1970 or 1914. And the same thing applies to Bitcoin. Now there is volatility because it's going through a process of monetization. It's becoming this global money. There are nation states which could potentially acquire more Bitcoin than Strategy. It would nominally become $100 million.
I think the best place to start with is, and you wrote an amazing article, and we can show them also later, where and how we get to this Bitcoin standard. Maybe as a starting point, how do you define a Bitcoin standard? What is this thing that we all call Bitcoin standard? Because I think a lot of people talk about it, and I don't know, different people probably have different definitions of it.
Yeah, well, obviously it comes from the whole idea of a monetary standard. So obviously from at least the late 19th century up until, let's say, 1971, we had the gold standard. So basically the currencies that were used around the world, although we had the US dollar, the Great British Pound, all these others, most of them were convertible to gold. So it's like a gold certificate, essentially. So we could say we're on a gold standard rather than a dollar standard. And the same thing applies to Bitcoin. So, if we imagine a world where Bitcoin is the global money, essentially, it could be that you have currencies that governments issue, but we know currencies are not the same thing as money. So the US dollar is a currency, but that doesn't mean it's money. So if the dollar could be convertible to gold, or at one stage it was convertible to gold and silver, and now it's a purely fiat currency, but it's still existed as a currency regardless of what it's backed by. Whereas Bitcoin is pure sound money, hard money. So under a Bitcoin standard, you could still have a US dollar. That's actually something I mentioned in my article. But in that case, the dollar would essentially be almost a denomination of Bitcoin. So whatever you value the dollar at, or Bitcoin at, you can set an exchange rate between the dollar and Bitcoin. So if we say that Bitcoin is $1 million, then that's the exchange rate. We could even say Bitcoin is $10 million or Bitcoin is $100 million. At the moment, the price of Bitcoin floats compared to other currencies because they're not pegged, that there's no Bitcoin standard in existence. So it's just like gold or any other asset. The value of any asset floats against the dollar. But that wasn't always the case. At one stage, there was a fixed rate of conversion between gold and the dollar. So, we could say, the price of gold is, it doesn't move. It stays the same. And how come now the price of gold shoots up and down and changes depending on the situation of the economy? So now gold looks like a more volatile asset than it was, let's say, 1970 or 1914. And the same thing applies to Bitcoin. Now there is volatility because it's going through a process of monetization. It's becoming this global money, and it's absorbing a lot of capital and wealth along the way as a sort of financial singularity. But a stage will come when the price of Bitcoin is either stable, relatively speaking, due to the size of its market cap, or it is stable in a perceived way because it is fixed to those supposed government currencies like the US dollar. So the US dollar is X amount of Bitcoin. It won't appear to be a volatile asset anymore, even though as the economy grows, the value of Bitcoin will probably still grow into infinity because the economy will continually grow, the population will increase. But in terms of how many dollars does it cost to buy one Bitcoin, that will appear to be completely stable if the government pegs it. So a Bitcoin standard could exist with that kind of conversion, but it can also exist independently of that. Let's say if all currencies simply collapse and disappear. That's more the hyper Bitcoinization scenario where everything just goes to pot and perhaps even governments collapse or systems collapse. Obviously, a lot of Bitcoin anarchists are sort of in favor of that kind of scenario. But it doesn't mean necessarily if we have a Bitcoin standard that governments no longer exist or governments collapse. Governments could actually shore themselves up and strengthen themselves through willingly adopting a Bitcoin standard. And that's one thing I mentioned in the article, that perhaps the US may be able to save itself in a way through adopting a Bitcoin standard.
That's super interesting. Also, the definition of what a Bitcoin standard actually looks like. So the two situations are: one, the government is pegging fiat to Bitcoin, and the second one is the fiat just doesn't exist anymore, and we just have Bitcoin as financial singularity, which I want to get to a little bit later also. Could you also imagine a point where Bitcoin is extremely dominant and almost like the default currency, but there are separate, let's say, government tokens like fiat currencies where, you need to have some of them to pay taxes, or like this is to interact with, I don't know, with a social security system in the government. And if you cannot pay for yourself, you get this social security tokens from a government, where there's like a very niche and small government tokens that are not packed to Bitcoin, but they're still there because the government wants to have some sort of control. Or does this not make sense at all when Bitcoin is already dominant and everyone can have Bitcoin? Why should they adopt the government token?
Well, I think, to do with the first point in terms of taxes and all of that, obviously, it's an inevitability. I think it was probably Benjamin Franklin who said, two of the inevitable things that exist are death and taxes. So as long as there are governments, there will be taxes, because governments want to fund themselves in some way. It doesn't mean there has to be an income tax necessarily. The US survived for most of its history without any income tax. But there will be some kind of tax, regardless of what kind of tax it is. But I think one of the main effects of Bitcoin becoming adopted by nation states is that it would constrain government's actions. It would shrink government because governments can no longer rely on infinite money printing. I mean, the US at the moment, funds itself mostly through money printing. It can fund itself through taxation. There's a certain amount of taxation that it takes in, but a lot of its spending relies upon creating money from thin air, adding to this massive national debt and the deficits. And that also relates to what you're saying about welfare, social security, all of that. I mean, that is probably the largest part of the US government budget, as I understand it, is actually these various social welfare programs, including Social Security for older people, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, all these other things. Of course, you also have a huge military budget as well. So there's the military and there's the social security side of things. But I think under a Bitcoin standard, both of those would have to be reduced quite significantly. I don't think you could fund those kind of deficits without massive money printing. As to whether you could have a fiat currency living, purely fiat currency alongside Bitcoin, it's possible. Just depends, I suppose, how far Bitcoin adoption goes. It is one of the scenarios that Seyr Ammous talks about in his Bitcoin Standard Research Bulletin, and also I think probably in the Fiat Standard itself, his second book. I haven't actually fully read that book, but I've read bits of it. So he talks about various scenarios how Bitcoin could be, how it could continue to exist even if it doesn't have hyper-Bitcoinization or global mass adoption. It could exist as a kind of asset that governments respond to because they know it's a threat. So they know that Bitcoin is there in the background as an alternative, better money, and because of that, they constrain themselves in order to, essentially prevent Bitcoin adoption. But at the same time, I think we're now seeing with the US adoption of Bitcoin that perhaps even some of those predictions of Seyr were not bullish enough, essentially, because he was saying, for example, that central banks are increasingly unlikely to adopt Bitcoin, and at least in the case of the US, that is true. The Federal Reserve itself is not adopting Bitcoin, but the US is adopting Bitcoin. There are also some central banks that are considering it, like the Czech National Bank. I haven't been following what's happened since their original announcement that they would consider it. But at least, even if they're considering it, that's a step in that direction. So even in that sense, there may be central banks which adopt Bitcoin potentially, but it doesn't have to be the central bank. It could be the nation state through a sovereign wealth fund, as we see in the Emirates, or in the US through a specific Bitcoin strategic reserve. So, and I think I thought that was an inevitability at some point, but I wouldn't have imagined it coming this soon, even a few years ago. And I don't think Seyr Ammous was imagining that when he was writing the Bitcoin Standard in 2018. But yeah, so I think it is possible that fiat currencies could continue to exist, but I do believe in this concept of the hardest money does eventually win. And I do think we're seeing signs of that. We're seeing the beginning of the rise of a Bitcoin standard.
So the most likely outcome at this point is basically financial singularity, where Bitcoin is the standard for the globe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's likely now. I think that the time for Bitcoin to fail has basically passed. That window of opportunity is gone. There was a time when governments, for example, could crush Bitcoin if they wanted to, like the United States government or others potentially could have crushed it at the outset. And they did try to a certain extent in terms of crushing, for example, the Silk Road, seizing Bitcoin, China shutting down Bitcoin mining. They did make some attempts to constrain Bitcoin, but I think we've moved past that. The Overton window has moved, and I think that now Bitcoin has reached this point of it's gained this momentum that is irresistible, so that even the U.S. government itself cannot resist this kind of onward march of Bitcoin.
It's that beautiful game theory, because the moment it was small enough to kill it, it was not attractive enough to actually allocate the resources to actually go ahead and kill it. So let's say 2011, if the US actually was like, hey, we don't like that, let's kill that, they could have done it because it was not that big at that moment. I think so. Maybe not. It's always hard to say like what happens if and stuff like that. But now, because it's so attractive, they cannot resist it and they have to kind of adopt it, because they know if they don't adopt it, someone else will. And this is the whole game theory, where either you come on board or you just get left behind at that point.
Yeah, exactly. And I think even now, I don't think the US government anyway, has ever fully understood what Bitcoin is and what it represents. And I think even now, they don't fully understand it. Certainly, I don't think President Trump understands it. He is pro-Bitcoin, which is great. He became pro-Bitcoin, I think, because of the fact that he realized that there's this group of people who could potentially help him to become president. So if he caters to this group of people, libertarians, Bitcoiners, etc., and cryptocurrency enthusiasts as well, if he caters to them, then they can help him to become president. And he surrounded himself with people who are themselves Bitcoiners, such as the new crypto AI czar. You've got David Sachs, you have Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, you have Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary. He's actually, I believe he's the head of or CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, which is that company that now is working with, was it SoftBank, and what was the other one? I forgot the other one now. But there's three companies that are working together to establish this 21 Capital.
Oh, Tether, right?
Oh yeah, Tether. Yeah, Tether, which is one of the major Bitcoin holders. Actually, Tether holds a huge amount of Bitcoin. But yeah, Tether, SoftBank, and Cantor Fitzgerald. And the guy behind Cantor Fitzgerald is Howard Lutnick, who is the Commerce Secretary in Trump's cabinet. He's also a billionaire. He personally holds a huge amount of Bitcoin himself. He's constantly acquiring it. And he's also, I think it's with Bessent, he's also the person who's responsible for what goes into the U.S. Sovereign Wealth Fund, which they've just created. So that U.S. Sovereign Wealth Fund itself could potentially acquire Bitcoin, or it could acquire even, shares in Strategy, MSTR. It could acquire shares in the 21 Capital, which is going to be indirectly Bitcoin, essentially. Well, it's going to be acquiring Bitcoin in competition with Michael Saylor's company. So it's just interesting that Trump has surrounded himself with these Bitcoiners, and even members of his family now, like Eric Trump, probably Donald Trump Jr. as well, I imagine. But Eric Trump especially is interested in Bitcoin mining, and he thinks Bitcoin's inevitably going to go to $1 million. And so he's very much pro-Bitcoin, especially due to the fact that his family has been debanked and, essentially financially persecuted at the same time as well. So, but even them, I think, they understand Bitcoin to a certain degree. Do they know that a Bitcoin standard would eventually replace the dollar as we know it? I'm not sure. I think they see it as this apex store of value, and they realize why the US should acquire it, because the US wants to increase its wealth, it wants to pay off the national debt, it wants to monetize its assets. And why should the US be selling and getting rid of the Bitcoin that it already holds? But yeah, I mean, Bessent and Sachs also want to acquire more Bitcoin for the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve as well, in a tax-neutral way, which could be anything from selling gold or selling other assets to issuing special bit bonds or Bitcoin bonds of some kind or another. But yeah, I think they don't quite see necessarily the end. I could be wrong. Maybe Howard Lutnick and these others actually do see the final vision of Bitcoin. But I'm not 100% certain that they do realize that the US dollar as we know it could cease to exist. Because on a Bitcoin standard, you could still have something called the US dollar, but it wouldn't be what it is now. It wouldn't be the US dollar that we know, which is the purely fiat currency. If it becomes backed by Bitcoin 100%, then it's essentially you're spending Bitcoin. You're just spending Bitcoin that you don't hold yourself. So if Bitcoin is denominated as $100 million per Bitcoin, then one Bitcoin is one Satoshi. So if you spend $1 on something, you are by default spending one Satoshi because they're backed 1-to-1. You're just not spending it on the Lightning Network or on the base chain. So it's kind of a way of scaling Bitcoin essentially. But in that sense, the US loses its power to print money because you can't print more than it holds in Bitcoin. So it needs to hold as much Bitcoin as it can in order to, issue dollars that are backed by that Bitcoin.
That's super interesting. Just a quick question on the 21 Capital, which will be, I think, led by Jack Mallers with the three companies together that you mentioned. Is that the first real competition to strategy?
I think it is, and I think it's the thing that's interesting about it is it's not a company that was doing something else that is now adopting a Bitcoin standard. That's been the example up to this point. Any company like MicroStrategy, or Strategy as it's now called, is a software company. It relies on business intelligence. It produces software. Now it's become a Bitcoin treasury company, but that was to save the company. And because Michael Saylor realized this will save my company, and it will also allow me to acquire this most valuable asset. But this now I think is the first real implementation of let's create a purpose-built Bitcoin treasury company. So it is competition in the sense that it's going to try and do what Strategy is already doing, and perhaps in some ways improve upon it, like, for example, releasing proof of reserves and other. Maybe they'll use different methods of raising money that I'm not aware of. But in terms of actually, are they on the same level as Strategy? Then I don't think necessarily they are, because what I mean by that is, can they significantly acquire Bitcoin to the level of Strategy? I don't think so, because there's a first mover advantage. There's no way really for anyone to catch up, because if you do catch up, that means you're acquiring hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin, and the supply is so limited that if you're doing that, you will significantly affect the price. If you significantly affect the price, you basically further push Strategy's lead ahead of you. So I think there is competition in terms of nation states, because there are nation states which could potentially acquire more Bitcoin than Strategy, like the United States, like China, and a handful of others, possibly, like some of the Gulf states, Arab Gulf states, a few other wealthy Asian nations. In Europe, I mean, there's a potential, but I think European governments at the moment are so myopic and so drunk on the fiat standard and the idea of centralized control, centralized governance, that they are unlikely to ever acquire as much as the United States, or as much as Strategy, simply because they don't have the will and the vision. But the United States can. China could potentially realize this long before the EU or the UK. The UK as well is pretty myopic in terms of Bitcoin. But luckily, they currently have, in theory, 61,000, I think it is, Bitcoin. So they've already got a certain amount by accident, essentially, or through taking it from criminals. So as long as they don't make the mistake that Germany made of selling all their Bitcoin, then they should be okay. The UK should be okay, but still, it's not going to catch up with strategy. I just think there's not enough Bitcoin in the world, essentially. If the US really got serious about it, they could acquire maybe 5 million Bitcoin if they wanted to, if they really get it. But if they're doing that, then China will want to compete. If China's also trying to get 5 million Bitcoin, there's only 21 million Bitcoin that can exist. And there's around, let's say 195 or maybe up to 200 countries in the world. So if you have roughly 200 countries, you have 21 million Bitcoin. You have companies that want to acquire Bitcoin. And also high net worth individuals, hedge funds, banks, you name it. How does everybody get enough Bitcoin? How does everyone get as much Bitcoin as they want? There's a limit to what you can acquire in Bitcoin, although Bitcoin itself can absorb any amount of wealth. So it could absorb all the wealth that's in existence in the world. And, you could absorb all of that into 21 million Bitcoin. But not everyone can get as much Bitcoin as they want. So it's in that sense, it's a zero-sum game. Even though wealth itself is not a zero-sum game, wealth can infinitely be created. There's no fixed pie of wealth in the world, but there is a fixed pie of an absolutely scarce currency. So Bitcoin is a fixed pie. So it is a zero-sum game. If someone gets more Bitcoin, someone else has less Bitcoin that they can get. So in that sense, as I said, I don't think that 21 Capital can compete to get as much Bitcoin as strategy. But I do think governments can compete with strategy if they're wealthy, powerful governments, not maybe the bottom 150 countries in the world, but maybe the top 20, 30, maybe up to 50 countries could potentially compete with strategy. But they have to be there first. They have to do it before the other countries, or they will lose, essentially.
Let's take a break for a moment and appreciate the beauty that Coin Vigilante has made with the Bitcoin watches. Those watches are the most amazing, the most elegant way of showing that you are a true Bitcoiner. And Coin Vigilante just dropped a completely new and amazing Genesis edition of their watch collections. You have the date of the first ever mined Bitcoin block in there, and of course also the block height and which epoch we are currently in. I love the level of detail they put in this masterpiece. Make sure to check out those amazing Coin Vigilante timepieces down in the descriptions. I love those watches so much. And now if you have Bitcoin, I really do hope that you don't have it on exchange. But if you do have it on exchange, I have two ways for you to deal with that. The first way is you put it on a hardware wallet. That's the entry for you to get into the self-custody game. I recommend BitBox, Bitcoin only edition for that. It's a super simple and secure way. And if you check out the link in the description, you even get 5% off if you use the code Robin. And the second way is the Bitcoin Way. The Bitcoin Way is your all-in partner in terms of how to get the most out of your sovereignty. They will personalize for you a self-custody setup that is perfect for your individual situation. They will show you how you can secure your own devices. Securing your Bitcoin is not enough. You also have to keep all your devices secure. One topic that is overlooked often is the inheritance plan. What happens with your Bitcoin once you are no longer here? Do you have a plan for that in place already? And last but not least, if if you're in the jurisdictions where you don't feel safe, it's better to get a plan B. For all that, head over to thebitcoinway.com/Robin to get a 30-minute free call. And just a quick side note, I will be for the first time ever speaking at the Bitcoin Prague event in June. It will be absolutely legendary, and I'm really looking forward to seeing all of you there. You can get your ticket in the link down in the description of Bitcoin Prague, and very important, use code Robin to get 10% off your ticket. I'm really looking forward seeing you there. Yeah, and it's a really tricky game because you have to be quick, but also not so aggressive that people notice it too much. So Donald Trump honestly is in one heck of a position because other world leaders might like, he's just crazy, and maybe he's selling all of the Bitcoin like in 1 year later and stuff like that. So if someone is currently in a great position to take the pole position in a Bitcoin world, it's the US. They have a really great position. Imagine the fear of missing out for Bitcoin if Joe Biden did the same thing. It would be a completely different thing. It's the same thing for me with, let's say, Tesla already bought Bitcoin. Like, that's an actual thing. We don't have to say that because Tesla actually bought already, I think now they have like 10,000 Bitcoin. This is not taken as serious as Apple would buy Bitcoin with the same percentage amount from the balance sheet and stuff like that. Because Apple is just looking at is taking it in a different light. And when you look from European perspective and other things, I don't know if it would be fun to see how people would react if someone where you don't expect something like that, like Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, like the Democrat Party, would do the same thing and say, oh, we have a strategic Bitcoin reserve and maybe we buy some. It is completely outlandish. I think it wouldn't have been possible. But that probably would trigger it faster. With all that, I just want to say, I think Trump is in a great position buying a lot of Bitcoin and other nation states being confused what he actually wants to do with that. Because he's known as an unpredictable guy. I mean, he wrote the art of the deal, and this is literally a point that he writes, like, never be predictable for your opponent. So that is a unique position to be in. I don't know if that was clear what I tried to communicate, but he's in a really unique position. The US is in a really unique position to get a huge head start in the next 4 years for Bitcoin world.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's also the fact that Trump is willing to try different things that haven't been tried before. I mean, an example of that is this U.S. sovereign wealth fund. Yeah, there are some nations which have sovereign wealth funds, like Norway, the United Arab Emirates, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, a number of other places. I think a few other probably European countries. But the U.S. has never tried that. So up till his election, things were just kind of business as usual. The Federal Reserve does the same things as usual. But now he's come into office. He's got interesting people around him. People with new ideas who want to try different things, and he's putting that into action. And I think he's the kind of person who says, crypto, Bitcoin, it might help us to pay off the national debt. Okay, let's try it. Let's figure out if that's going to happen. Let's buy some Bitcoin. Let's put it in a reserve. If it helps us to pay off the debt in 10 years, 15 years, great. He was actually saying that in one quote where he was saying, maybe we pay off the debt with some Bitcoin. Maybe we pay it off with a crypto check or something like that, he was saying. So, he doesn't fully understand what Bitcoin is, but he thinks, well, maybe some people have told me it could pay off the national debt. Let's try it. Let's see if that works. So, because that's the thing about, I think, entrepreneurs and business people, is that they want to try things, see if they work. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, and you just try something else. but you should try it. If someone's got a good idea, okay, let's try your idea, see if it works. It's a very different kind of mentality from a traditional politician. The politician says, well, our experts have told us in this report that we need to, keep inflation at 2%, and we need to do this and do that. That's kind of the politician's mentality. What's our political party? What's our platform? Okay, we promise to do this. But a businessman comes in and says, okay, well, we might need to break some things in order to make other things work. We might need to try some new ideas that haven't been tried before. And that seems to be what he's doing at the moment. Some of the things he does may not work. Some of the things he does may make things worse. But he's just trying and seeing, what will work. And that's why it's great that he's looking into Bitcoin, and he has people around him who have a higher level of understanding of Bitcoin than he has, like David Sachs, Besant, and Lutnick. So at least they are now implementing things that he might not have thought of himself, like, as I said, new methods of acquiring Bitcoin for the fund, which are tax neutral, which don't involve creating new debt to buy the Bitcoin. So maybe at some point in the future we get a really pro Bitcoin president who actually says, let's just print the dollar and buy Bitcoin, which is, I think, something Seyr talked about. He said, the first country to print its currency to buy Bitcoin wins. But at the moment, that's not the US approach. The US approach is, let's find ways that don't hurt the taxpayer that will allow us to acquire more Bitcoin. So I think, America is in this unique position because they have this entrepreneur president. China at the moment, and Russia and other countries, they do recognize, perhaps to a degree, that Bitcoin is a unique asset and it's doing things. I think certainly Putin has mentioned Bitcoin. He understands Bitcoin to a certain extent. I don't really know what the president of China's understanding of Bitcoin is, but at the moment they seem to recognize that the current U.S. order, the current dollar standard that exists, is coming to an end. The dominance of the US dollar is coming to an end, and they are now hedging themselves by acquiring as much gold as they can. They're massively acquiring gold, and that's probably been good for them financially at the moment because of the price of gold going up. The price of gold going up is a sign of the collapse of the dollar, essentially. But it may be a mistake on their part because they're thinking maybe too traditionally. They see you've got dollar or you've got something else. What's the something else? Well, traditionally it's been gold. And that may mean that they make a mistake. And this is something interesting that you read in the Bitcoin standard about when the gold standard was adopted at the end of the 19th century. There were countries which got on the gold standard, like Britain, the British Empire, got on the gold standard, and it did very well as a result of that. Whereas China at the time didn't get on the gold standard, and they were still using, I think, silver and other things. And so as a result, China ended up in a very weak position, and they got basically pushed around, and obviously Britain managed to get Hong Kong, and they weren't doing so well. So you wonder if China and Russia are potentially making the same mistake again by adopting gold, or at least acquiring gold, instead of acquiring Bitcoin. And you wonder at what point will they recognize that they should be acquiring Bitcoin? Is it too late? Is it after the US has already said, okay, we're going to get 10% of the Bitcoin or something? Is the US going to start acquiring 1 million Bitcoin, and then China and Russia finally realize, oh, actually, we should be acquiring Bitcoin, and then they could potentially sell their gold for that, possibly. So it's interesting to see, how does game theory play out? At the moment, I don't think the race has started. I don't think nation states are already racing to get Bitcoin. At the moment, it's still an obscure thing. It's still, even though the US has a Bitcoin strategic reserve, they themselves have not started acquiring more Bitcoin in that reserve that we know about yet. They still haven't announced the result of their audit of how much Bitcoin they do actually hold at the moment. We think it's around 200,000, but nobody's verified that yet. So I think we're still at a very early stage before the game theory actually kicks in and nation states do start rushing to buy Bitcoin. I think that will happen, and then some nation states will get ahead, others will get left behind. I think China will still be in a good position because of its wealth. But any nation state that does get left behind will not be doing so well, unfortunately. And that could affect Europe, it could affect Latin America, it could affect many places if they don't actually realize that they're missing out.
That was a lot in there. We also talked. Where do I begin? One thing I just want to show. I searched it up while you were talking. Maybe that for people that haven't seen that, because I think it's really interesting that Donald Trump actually said that, and I hope everyone can hear that now. I saw the point, and he actually said that in two different occasions, and this is now one of them where he was on an interview. But he also said it at an event where a Bitcoiner asked him, "Oh, what do you think about Bitcoin? What can Bitcoin do?" Basically, but this I feel like is might be the better one. So just like see what he said directly.
They think it's good. Who knows? Maybe we'll pay off our $35 trillion, hand him a little crypto check, right? We'll hand him a little Bitcoin and wipe out our $35 trillion. But how do you?
I don't know. Did you hear it? It's
I heard it. Yeah.
Exactly like that he just said, like, we might wipe out our 35 trillion. I mean, at that point, I think it's now already 36 or 37 trillion. With a little crypto or Bitcoin check. Let's give them some Bitcoin for that. Yes, it might be comical in the first sense, like when you hear that and how he says it. The implications of that is someone actually talked with him about that. He would not say that on national TV because he had one idea in his head or something. Like somewhere this idea in his head came to be. And there was some Bitcoiner that talked with him, or some people, some group that talked about that. Like, yeah, we could have a Bitcoin strategic reserve and pay down our debt. And also, Cynthia Lummis, I think, this was the way she reasoned in the bill that this can make the US more sovereign and also pay down the debt. So this is something that could be bigger than we think. But yeah, maybe it's also just like a comical thing that he said in that moment. But I do think it's something you kind of have to pay attention to what he says and what that actually means.
Yeah, I definitely agree that if it's something that he's thinking about, it doesn't mean that that's necessarily going to happen. But also, this is something that goes beyond his presidency as well, because if we look at, for example, the proposals that Senator Lummis makes in her Bitcoin bill, I mean, the idea initially, I think, is that America should acquire 1 million Bitcoin over a period of 5 years. So that's 200,000 Bitcoin per annum. In the original version of her bill, that was the absolute limit on what the US could acquire, that they could acquire up to 200,000 Bitcoin per annum. And now I believe, I think I read it, that it's sort of the base that America acquires 200 Bitcoin per annum. So it could acquire more than that, potentially. And then I think she was saying that within, I don't know if she said 10 or 20 years, it could pay off something like half the debt. I think that was her idea. Now, I know that Michael Saylor, I don't remember the exact numbers that Saylor used, but Saylor himself also had a proposal regarding Bitcoin and digital assets. And part of that, again, was paying off the national debt, whereas he suggested that the US could pay off the entire national debt. I don't know if that's also something that he discussed at the crypto summit in the White House, because the part that was actually aired was kind of the initial comments, like Trump's initial comments and the other people in the room. But I think the actual crypto summit went on a bit after the cameras switched off, and Saylor didn't speak in the part that was on camera, but perhaps afterwards Saylor spoke and gave some ideas, and Trump would have heard those ideas as well. Though this is after that, the clip that you just showed, that's before, I think that might have even been before he was elected, when he did that clip. I don't remember the.
Yeah, it was, I think, before he was elected, actually.
Yeah, exactly, which is very interesting. So there are different proposals. I mean, Cynthia Lummis is kind of a base case proposal that would talk about eliminating potentially half the debt. Saylor's proposal is to eliminate all the debt, and of course he wants the US to acquire a lot more than 1 million Bitcoin, I think up to 5 million Bitcoin, which is similar also to Robert Kennedy Jr.'s proposal. You know, when he was running for president, he proposed also to establish a Bitcoin strategic reserve, but to acquire, I think, up to 5 million Bitcoin. And it's interesting that he's also in Trump's cabinet as well. So he's also another Bitcoiner there in the cabinet. In fact, I think he said at one point that most of his wealth is in Bitcoin. So Robert Kennedy is a real, Bitcoiner, Bitcoin bull who just mostly holds Bitcoin. So that's very interesting as well. So yeah, I think that those ideas are out there. But as I was saying, in terms of denomination, I think, potentially to wipe out the debt, you can do that sort of through a kind of default in a way, but by devaluing the dollar. Now, I know that at least officially, Trump and his team want to strengthen the US dollar, but I'm sure many of them are aware that really, at some point you have to devalue the dollar. Especially in terms of the debt and the deficit spending and all of that. And that's always been the case throughout the fiat standard, that you've had to devalue the dollar to kind of devalue the debt, and also make yourself competitive. There's other economic reasons as well. But in terms of wiping out the debt, if you change the exchange rate, fix the exchange rate between Bitcoin and the dollar, it doesn't have to be close to the natural exchange rate. So at the moment, for example, Bitcoin is $94,000. But even now, if the US government came along and said, okay, we're establishing a Bitcoin standard in the US, we're denominating, 1 Bitcoin as $100 million, then they could do that even now. I mean, you could have 1 Bitcoin worth $100 million tomorrow if the US government said so. But that would be a massive devaluation of the US dollar, essentially. It wouldn't be actually changing the real value of Bitcoin, not through the denomination, although actually adopting a Bitcoin standard would mean that it becomes more desirable, and hence the real value of Bitcoin would also go up in that sense. But it would nominally become $100 million. That could happen even tomorrow, but obviously it probably won't. But when it is finally, when the US dollar is finally devalued in that sense, Bitcoin will probably be a lot closer to that. Bitcoin could already be $10 million, let's say, on the actual exchange rate. So Bitcoin could be worth $10 million, and the US government says, okay, we want to devalue the debt. So even though Bitcoin is $10 million right now, we want to make it $100 million. So they're essentially, making the dollar a tenth of its current value by pegging it to Bitcoin. So that I think that's possible.
You mentioned now the $100 million, I think like 2 or 3 times. Is that kind of, I know when we come to a Bitcoin standard, it does not make sense to price Bitcoin in US dollars. Bitcoin will price other things. But I think right now in the world, the US dollar or euro, this is kind of the reference point for unit of account. Even Bitcoin businesses like BTC that are Bitcoin only, they denominate their prices on the back end in US dollars or euros. The same way I have Bitcoin as a bigger and bigger income and expense stream actually. But still, all my prices, all my relationships with the partners, everything is always denominated usually in euros or dollars. So, because the reference point now with US dollar is still very relevant and is in the Bitcoin standard not relevant, what would you say would be the Bitcoin price under a Bitcoin standard if it would make sense to value it in today's dollars terms? And you mentioned $100 million, so I was like, maybe you're looking at that price point.
Yeah, well, obviously 100 million is a kind of convenient price point because, you know, 1 Bitcoin is 100 million Satoshis. So it's a very even way of kind of balancing it against existing fiat currencies. But I think we're going to get closer and closer towards that. You know, Hal Finney, for example, right near the beginning of Bitcoin, I think it was around 2010 or so, or actually it might have been 2009, he actually suggested that if you take the value of all the wealth in the world, or all the assets in the world, and divide it by the number of Bitcoin, then you get a price target of $10 million per Bitcoin. And this is when Bitcoin actually had $0 value that he was saying this. Bitcoin was literally $0. It was free, essentially. Bitcoin was free at the point that Hal Finney was saying this. So to have that kind of vision, he was also the first person to talk about, you know, layer twos and the necessity for Bitcoin banks, essentially the financialization of Bitcoin, because he imagined in the future that most people would not be transacting directly on the base chain. So this shows you how intelligent and visionary Hal Finney was from the very beginning. It's just so unfortunate that he died, you know, in the early days of Bitcoin, because he would be a really great proponent and Bitcoin thinker now. I mean, I think the only other person I can think of with that kind of vision about Bitcoin that early on would probably be Nick Szabo himself, because he you know, he's the one who came up with the concept of BitGold, and BitGold was before Bitcoin. It was around, well, at least several years before Bitcoin that he came up with the concept of BitGold, and BitGold anticipated layer 2 technologies, that you wouldn't actually transact on the BitGold layer 1, but you would need a layer 2 on top of the BitGold. So he has a very good vision economically and financially of Bitcoin. If you read any of his writings, like his essay Shelling Out about the history of money, he really understands the economics of Bitcoin. Yeah, $10 million was a proposal around like 15 years ago. I know Michael Saylor has his base case that by 2045, I think it is, Bitcoin will be $13 million. But he does, if I recall, have an actual bull case as well, which is multiples of that. I don't remember if it's like probably 30, 40, 50 million per Bitcoin by 2045. So, you know, if we can denominate everything in the world in Bitcoin, if we can, or if Bitcoin even takes, like Saylor suggests, I think he suggests something like 7% of all the wealth in the world, I mean, even then, Bitcoin is at a massive price. But if Bitcoin is the prime savings vehicle, and if it is the standard, the monetary standard for the planet, and everything is denominated in Bitcoin, then the price in terms of dollars would be enormous, and it would approach, closer to $100 million. Then it's difficult to say, because obviously the wealth in the world keeps growing. So if you ever make these calculations, you have to change them again. And also there's the relative value of the fiat currencies. It's very, very difficult to actually say what is that figure if you take all the wealth in the world and calculate backwards based on that. So yeah, it's a bit difficult to say what the price would be. Even what would be the price of Bitcoin reaching gold parity? That's another question, because that keeps changing as well. A few years ago, it would have been, much less, maybe, $400,000 per Bitcoin or $500,000 per Bitcoin. Now it's getting close to $1 million. So if you wanted gold to have the same market cap, or Bitcoin to have the same market cap as gold, then Bitcoin would be closer to $1 million now. And that might keep increasing if the value of gold goes up, because you don't have to denominate Bitcoin in dollars. As you say, it's a very convenient method. It's even an argument some people use against Bitcoin. How does Bitcoin have any value if you have to, exchange it for dollars? Isn't it just based on the dollar then, if you have to exchange it for dollars? But you can exchange it for gold. You can exchange it for ounces of gold. There's a certain number of ounces of gold that's equivalent to 1 Bitcoin. And that has been also going up over time. If you look at a chart of Bitcoin versus gold, the value of Bitcoin goes up against gold. I think at the moment, Bitcoin is probably very undervalued in its gold value. So I think it has a huge, I don't even think we're in necessarily anywhere near like bull market territory in terms of its gold value, because I think the value of gold has gone up and Bitcoin hasn't caught up necessarily in this cycle yet. It's caught up maybe in fiat terms, but not in gold terms yet. So there's a huge amount of growth to go, I think, in terms of gold value of Bitcoin. But yeah, so you can denominate Bitcoin in gold, you can denominate it in dollars, but at the end of the day, that's all kind of artificial. As I said, you can fix the price of Bitcoin against dollars if you want. You can change the number of dollars that are convertible into 1 Bitcoin. So ultimately, what is the value in purchasing power or the ability to buy things? And I think that will always go up in value over time, regardless of what the exchange rate is, because the wealth of mankind will go up over time, and Bitcoin, as a result, being this fixed asset, will go up in value. So under a Bitcoin standard, it will have a huge value that we can't even necessarily compute at the moment.
It's a good thing, yeah. And that's why we always have to say in today's dollars terms. We also have from Jesse Myers, the model of what's the wealth in the world. And he basically would need to update that model probably every year, because it keeps getting bigger, the numbers, because the underlying asset that we measuring it in, the US dollar or euro, whatever it is getting devalued. So everything else gets higher. So it's a really good insight. That's why I really do like to compare Bitcoin with gold. If you actually go ahead and say, what is 1 kilogram, 1 ounce, whatever the weight of 1 bar of gold is, what is that? How much Bitcoin do I need to buy that? Do I need 1 Bitcoin? Do I need 0.1 Bitcoin? And denominate basically the Bitcoin price in gold. And I think at that point, you get a way more realistic price of what Bitcoin actually is outside of the devaluation, because there's 2 reasons why Bitcoin is growing in price. The one is the devaluation of the underlying fiat currencies. That's why we see Bitcoin reaching faster all-time highs in the Argentine peso, in the Turkish lira, because those are just even worse fiat currencies. And the other thing is Bitcoin is getting adopted as a network. I'm orange billing a person. He comes on the network. I'm orange billing another one. They're coming on the network. More people understand why Bitcoin is superior, and the asset just grows in its network. And that's why it also is growing. So there's like two aspects to it. It's kind of the monetization part of it and the devaluation part of what we are measuring in it. So that's, it's always so funny. I was at a conference and someone asked me like, oh, do you think Bitcoin can reach 10 million? And I was like, of course. Oh, 100 million. Yeah, of course. Yeah. What about 1 billion? Yeah, like at some point the dollars will be devalued, and so it goes to infinity in theory. So we will reach all the prices from 0 to infinity at some point, because it's just like at some point it does not even make sense to measure it in. I had one guest on, I think he was the most bullish. He said you will be able to buy a spaceship with one Satoshi. But he didn't put a time frame on it. It's just like one mission, one vision that he looks at.
Well, I'm not sure about that. That's a bit optimistic. One Satoshi.
Yeah, it's basically the theory. I mean, at that point we are not only on Earth, we expanded the species, and he said like we that episode was so fun. He basically said we put solar panels all around the sun, on I think on Mercury or something like that. It was to use it for Bitcoin mining and,
So that's taking us to type something or other on the Kardashev scale. There's this Kardashev scale. I don't remember what's on the Kardashev scale, but yeah.
There's type 0 till 4, I think. The type 4 is the most advanced one. But I'm also not an expert. Like, I don't know what. I just know that we are not even 1 yet.
Yeah, I know. I could probably look it up. But it's not something I know off the top of my head. But yeah, well, in terms of that, I mean, that's why I like the book, The Price of Tomorrow by Jeff Booth. I don't know if you read that, but he talks about this kind of, explosion of technology and artificial intelligence and all of this stuff that will actually make, naturally, it makes everything get cheaper over time. So ultimately, that's another aspect. Bitcoin goes up in value because of its, scarcity and demand for that scarce asset. But at the same time, if technology is massively improving, the price of things should be going down. And it's also something that Seyr mentions in his book, Principles of Economics, which I found quite interesting as well, that we're basically getting better and better at producing things. It's not getting more expensive to produce food or to get oil and all these other assets. Over time, every resource that we have gets cheaper to acquire, and technology gets cheaper over time as well. I mean, a computer, used to be incredibly expensive. 1 megabyte used to be really expensive. You have 1 megabyte of data, and now 1 megabyte of data is nothing. You've got gigabytes of data. So, yeah, ultimately, your Bitcoin purchasing power should go up, even in terms of everything getting cheaper over time. So that's another way that the value of Bitcoin can go up, besides obviously devaluation of fiat currencies, but also everything becoming cheaper through technology, leading to Bitcoin being able to buy more things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good point. And one thing that I also had in mind, the way we get to this Bitcoin standard is because we have now nation states already involved in Bitcoin and being friendly to Bitcoin, that we have kind of a soft landing adoption or a peaceful adoption of Bitcoin versus a hard reset, because nation states already trying to incorporate Bitcoin, and so softly, smoothly transitioning. Maybe I'm just dreaming here, but softly, smoothly transitioning to a Bitcoin standard.
Yeah, well, I think we've got good indications of that. I think it was a critical moment when President Trump was elected. I think even the fact that he survived that assassination attempt. There's lots of memes about it on X or Twitter that have you seen the ones where his head is turned one way and then it's turned a different way, and it's like one is $200,000 Bitcoin, or one is another thing. There's lots of versions of this meme, because all it took was him turning to look at a diagram that he had on a screen, and the bullet at that moment just grazed past his head and hit his ear, basically caused his ear to bleed. But if his head was turned the other way, the bullet would have gone straight through his skull and out the other side, and he would have died instantly. So it's interesting that it's almost like the fate of the world or future human history was kind of just resting on that moment when he turned his head. So you do wonder, we'd be somewhere different perhaps if he wasn't elected and the US decided not to establish a Bitcoin strategic reserve, because his opponent didn't even want to come to the Bitcoin conference, and basically refused to do anything related to Bitcoin, presumably because she realized that her own policies were not in any way aligned with the policies of Bitcoin. So what's the point? Like, what's the point of coming to the Bitcoin conference if you've got nothing positive to say about Bitcoin? So it is interesting that sometimes history comes down to these moments where something critical happens that wouldn't have happened otherwise. One person lives instead of dying. One person gets elected instead of another person. So many things like that. I mean, even if you think in terms of British history, Henry VII's son, eldest son, was Prince Arthur. He was the one who was meant to lead. His second son, Henry, was meant to become a priest and just go into the church and all of that. What happens? Arthur dies. Henry becomes Henry VIII, and Henry VIII does everything that he did. Establishing the Church of England and breaking away from Rome and changing the course of history. But just because one person died and another person lived, the whole history of Britain has changed. The whole future of England changed based on that one person dying and another person living. So the same thing's happening with Trump being elected. Whether or not you support Trump or like Trump or think he's a good person or not, he's changing history just by being president. So yeah, in terms of what you're saying, would we have this soft landing, or will we have a hard reset? It's still to be decided, I think. I think we're on a good path now in terms of the US potentially acquiring, at least 1 million more Bitcoin than they currently have, potentially, and potentially going in the direction of a Bitcoin standard, and maybe wiping out the debt, and maybe doing this and that and the other. But that's not written in stone yet. Things could still happen that push America in a different direction. You could still have potentially, World War III scenario. You could have all sorts of things could happen in history. I mean, even now there's tensions between India and Pakistan, both nuclear nations. Anything can happen. What will happen between China and the US in their tariff war? So many scenarios. So there's a possibility that we get to a stage where the US debt is not solved, and the US dollar becomes hyperinflated and collapses, and the government could collapse, and all sorts of things could happen. And then Bitcoin does go to infinity dollars if the dollar, becomes worthless, essentially. So there's no exchange rate then. The dollar is just, one Bitcoin is infinite dollars at that point. Or the US could say, let's establish a Bitcoin standard, and this is the exchange rate between Bitcoin and the dollar. In that case, Bitcoin doesn't go to infinity dollars because the dollar has a fixed price in Bitcoin. So Bitcoin can keep going up in value, but the dollar exchange rate doesn't change. So there's lots of possibilities. I think it's good to be optimistic at this stage, but anything could happen, and we could still end up in a kind of dystopian situation or hyper-Bitcoinization situation.
I 100% agree. And I think the next US election, so we had the last one now, 2024, next one will be 2028. It will be between two candidates of both political aisles that will fight for who is most bullish on Bitcoin. They will fight for the Bitcoin voting bloc. It surprised me that at this election, we already had kind of not a fight for the Bitcoin vote, but more of like one candidate really wanted the Bitcoin voting bloc. So now it's only logical for me 4 years down the road with all the developments that will happen in the next 4 years for Bitcoin, that the same thing on both sides will have to happen, because Bitcoiners will just be such a huge amount of voters that you cannot miss. And Bitcoiners are also very passionate about their Bitcoin. If you speak ill about my Bitcoin, I will hate you. So it will be very bad for one candidate to openly speak bad about Bitcoin. So why not embrace it and say good things about it to maybe persuade one or the other Bitcoiner from Republican to Democrats? Because there will be maybe Republicans voted Trump for Bitcoin, and now they're like, shit, tariffs and all. Like maybe they like some things of him not. They're like, hey, there's like a Democrat candidate that I really enjoy and I like, and he's also for Bitcoin and he likes Bitcoin. So I think game theory is very clear that from now on the US will have, I mean, maybe I'm dreaming again, but from now on the US will have pro-Bitcoin candidates and presidencies. And this is something amazing. I mean, on the right side, or Republican, we probably already have a candidate with JD Vance, I guess, that will be pro Bitcoin. And then we see what the Democrat side comes up with. I heard with AOC and how's that old man called?
Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, Bernie Sanders. Yeah, but I don't think I hope for the Democrat Party that those two are not doing it. I don't know if it would be good, but yeah, maybe also. But yeah, my thing is like there's no turning back now for the US for being pro Bitcoin.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say who else will be running in 2028. But yeah, JD Vance, as far as I'm aware, he had disclosed owning, I think it was around 6 Bitcoin, something like that. And this is long before Trump became pro-Bitcoin. So certainly JD Vance is a Bitcoiner, although I've not heard him. I've not seen any speeches or anything where he's talking about Bitcoin or anything like that. So I think I'm not really sure what his exact views are on Bitcoin. He seems to have been in the background so far with all that stuff. It's been Trump talking, and then obviously the Commerce Secretary, Treasury Secretary, Crypto AI Czar, those guys speaking. So maybe someone else has seen some clips or something where he talks about Bitcoin. So I'm not sure what his views are on Bitcoin, but I believe he's pro Bitcoin as far as I'm aware. So yeah, I think there's no putting the genie back in the bottle in that sense. I think with governments and government systems, it's very difficult to change once something is put into existence, once something is created. Well, probably the biggest example is maybe the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913, I think, 1913, just before World War I started. And, there's been no push or no means to eliminate it so far. In theory, I think it could just be eliminated through an act of Congress. You just have to sort of repeal the Federal Reserve Act, I think, and then there's no more Federal Reserve. But why hasn't that happened in more than 110 years? Because it's very difficult to put things back the way that they were beforehand. The same thing, I think, in the UK with the NHS, for example. I mean, the NHS, was created after World War II by the, I think it was the Labour Party, and obviously Churchill was booted out of power, and then he got re-elected I think in the next election, but he didn't get rid of the NHS. And the NHS has existed up till now, and nobody is against it because it's almost like political suicide to say, oh, let's abolish the NHS, or even privatizing the NHS. That's almost political suicide because there's so much kind of support for the National Health Service in the UK. So it's like that. It's difficult once things come into existence to get rid of them. The Bitcoin strategic reserve is still very young at this stage, so it's kind of maybe vulnerable at the moment. It could be reversed, especially if there's no legislation in place to preserve it. I think that's the key thing at the moment now, is getting something like Cynthia Lummis's Bitcoin Act to be passed by Congress, because then that can kind of enshrine the Bitcoin strategic reserve into law, and then it becomes very difficult because then you have to get both houses of Congress to repeal that act in order to get rid of it, just like the Federal Reserve Act or the Social Security or any of these other institutions. It's very difficult to get rid of them once they're created. Even Obamacare, which Republicans were against, it still exists in some form now. They've not been able to completely reverse it yet. So once it gets into law, it's difficult to get rid of. So I think that's the key thing now, getting some of these things into law, like the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve, like Trump's sovereign wealth fund. All this kind of stuff needs to be legislated. And once it's legislated, the next president is unlikely to come and say, okay, I'm abolishing the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve and selling all the Bitcoin.
I think it's an amazing point. And I'm really curious also now, like, of how this Bitcoin standard will be and how you look at what are the implications of that. But we have already further down the podcast road. Maybe that's a topic we can pick up in a third round. And for everyone that didn't see, this is already the second round with Nicolas. So I just want to share that quickly with people. If you want to hear more, we had a really fun talk with you just a year ago, and it was also fun because the price was a lot less back then. Not a lot less, but quite substantial less. I think it was like half the price or something like that. And $1 million now seems almost more reachable because we already hit over 100K. And it also was a video where we actually talked about the 100K mark, as far as I remember, being some kind of emotional trigger. So it's fun to go back in history and see what we thought back then. And we have a new end routine question. I mean, we have an end routine question that's always the same, but one question that I ask each and every one of my guests that comes on the podcast again. And the question is, what have you learned outside of Bitcoin since you last been on the podcast?
Well, since I've last been on the podcast, that's a difficult question. Obviously, so much has changed in terms of Bitcoin. Do you mean just in terms of Bitcoin or in terms of like anything?
Oh no, actually outside of Bitcoin. Because I'm really curious what Bitcoin has also spent the time with. And usually my first question, if someone was not on the podcast, I'm asking like, oh, what can we learn from you besides Bitcoin? And now with returning guests, I'm asking, what have you learned outside of Bitcoin since you last been on? It can be very small, like it doesn't have to be world changing, but something that you have picked out, because I'm just curious, what are Bitcoiners spending their time on outside of talking and thinking about Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, my interests perhaps are very, I have sort of very narrow interests, maybe in a way. I mean, I like things like history, so I'm always watching like history documentaries and reading books and stuff. I mean, obviously, I read a lot about Bitcoin and think about Bitcoin quite a bit as well. I'm quite into sort of reading about the history of religion and religious ideas as well. I mean, that's something that I think about quite a lot in terms of that society needs to develop not just materially, but also in terms of the development of virtue and morality and being a good society. I don't think it's enough just to fix the money. That's something that I think about quite a bit. That Bitcoin, you can say for any number of problems that Bitcoin fixes this, but it doesn't fix necessarily the culture and the morals and values of a people. And that's something I think about quite a bit is, what are the actual morals and values of a society or a civilization? And I did write about, how, similar to Seyr Dean's ideas, how, Bitcoin can fix civilization in many ways. But I think fundamentally, it's about fixing people's characters and their behaviors and being a good and moral society.
Interesting. I love that. And this is exactly where we really have to do a third round then with like, what are the implications of Bitcoin and how do we get to a good Bitcoin standard? But yeah, thank you so much. We have an end routine, as you know, in the podcast where the previous guest is asking a question for the next guest without knowing who the next guest actually is. And the question for you today is, do you consider Bitcoin to be an invention or a discovery, and why?
Okay, that's a good question. Well, I think actually the Bitcoin as a protocol and as a solution to, let's say, the Byzantine generals problem and all of that, I think that is, I think the actual Bitcoin code and blockchain, Bitcoin as it is an invention. But certain aspects of it, like the concept of digital scarcity or absolute scarcity, is a discovery. So I think you have to take the abstract from the particular. The particular code and system that we use was invented by Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever he may be. But the ideas behind it could have been discovered by somebody else, and it would have been at some point, even if Satoshi Nakamoto had not invented Bitcoin in, let's say, 2008, when he was, I think might have been a bit earlier as well, because he said he took, I think it was like a year or a year and a half to actually code Bitcoin. So it might have been like 2007 or even earlier possibly. But his discovery of how to solve the Byzantine generals problem and how to create this digital absolute scarcity, that could have been discovered by someone else. It just happens to be that Bitcoin was the implementation of that. And because it's the first and it had that kind of immaculate conception, Bitcoin is the digital scarcity that we have, and it can't be replicated because it's been done once, and you can't really replicate the circumstances that led to the creation of Bitcoin and the gradual growth and adoption of Bitcoin. So you can't really replicate that. But had it not been created by him, then it could have been created by someone else in a slightly different way, with a different name, different code, etc. But it still would have solved the same problems as Bitcoin. So that digital scarcity and that ledger, distributed ledger, and the solution to the Byzantine generals problem, those things were discovered, I think, because they're kind of abstract.
Yeah, it's a good way to take it a part of like what was discovered and what is kind of the invention behind it, and not just like put the whole thing in one category. That's really good. Yeah, thank you so much, Nicholas. Before I let you go, where can people find you, ask questions, and reach out to you?
Well, mainly through Twitter, I think, at Nicholas19 on Twitter, on X, as they now call it. Obviously, I've got that blog on Medium, which I think you'll have a link to. But yeah, I think that's probably the best place to contact me in the first instance.
Absolutely. Really cool. Thank you so much for your time. And also thank you so much for everyone that is watching and listening for joining us today. As always, I'll be back tomorrow with another episode. Bye-bye.
Thank you.